Welcome to the Upper Room. I want to welcome you to a special Resurrection Sunday edition of the Upper Room, and we're going to begin with a discussion question. And it's a question that I doubt if you've ever been asked before. And the question is this: what do you think is the problem with the resurrection? Is there a problem? Well, certainly the problem is not enough convincing evidence. There is more than enough evidence for the resurrection. We've gone into that in great detail in other lessons, so we're not going to really talk about the convincing evidence, which there is, for the resurrection. Well, Steve, then what is the problem with the resurrection? Let me tell you, it's not enough convincing evidence, but it is a lack of context, I believe. I believe that we often at this time of the year talk about the resurrection, but we leave out the context, which is enormous. We find the resurrection to be fascinating, interesting, but oftentimes an isolated event. As interesting as it is, we quickly move on to Easter eggs and chocolate bunnies. But today, we're going to talk about context, because without the context, the resurrection does not mean what it ought to mean to us. So we often get hung up on the event itself, the details of the event, right? The burial, the big boulder, the boom, the bowling over of the Roman soldiers, and the bewildered women. But having covered those details before, we're going broader. We're going to talk about the broad idea that it's not just about the details of the event, but it is actually about the person of Jesus. I want to take you to the Transfiguration, the Mount of Transfiguration, if you will, where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up the mountain, and there they see Jesus joined by Moses and Elijah. And they're in awe of that, so much so that Peter says, let's put up a gift shop. Let's sell some things so we never forget what we've seen and people can know this happened here. Well, why was that such a big deal to Peter, James, and John? It's because Moses represented the law and Elijah represented, of course, the prophets, and their entire lives were about the law and the prophets. And so when the law and the prophets joined Jesus, wow, now they saw everybody is the same. Jesus is just as important as Moses and Elijah. And yet, I'll bet you remember that then the Father from heaven speaks and says, this is my Son, listen to him. He sets him apart. And when he speaks, the disciples are blown away. They fall down on their faces, and we pick it up in Matthew chapter 17, verse 5. This is my dearly loved Son who brings me great joy. Listen to him. The disciples were terrified and fell face down on the ground. Then in verse 7, Jesus comes over to them, touches them, and says, get up, don't be afraid. And when they looked up, Moses and Elijah were gone. And here are the 4 words I want you to focus in on. And they saw only Jesus. I had a friend text that verse to me this last week, and I'd forgotten that verse was right there. They saw only Jesus. That is what we're going to do today, all right? It's really tempting to go back into the details of the resurrection, but it's essential that we see only Jesus. And so today, what we're going to do is we're going to listen to a story Jesus tells, the statements he made, and then the startling things that happen to solidify our status with him at the cross. That's the context for the resurrection. Is there any evidence that we should just focus on Jesus? Yes, there is. John chapter 11, Jesus shows up late, or so Lazarus' sisters thought he was late, to heal Lazarus before he dies. And so he comes after he's already dead. And of course it's Martha that is impetuous and impulsive and not satisfied. And she says to Jesus, if only you'd been here, he would not have died. In other words, translation, this is your fault. How does Jesus respond? Is he defensive? Does he get angry with her? No. You look at John 11:25, Jesus says to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Again, 4 words. I am the resurrection. Have you ever paused right there and realized that when we talk about the resurrection, you have to talk about Jesus? He is the resurrection. That's who he is. And so we will begin with the story he told. And I want to call this a resurrection story. And I'm doubting whether you've ever seen it as a resurrection story. But it is, and I'll show it to you. This story is found in the back half of Luke chapter 15. So if you'll turn there, we're going to really dig into this story he told. But to set us up, I want to tell you about something that happened last week. Last week, I was sitting with my grandsons and my sons at a baseball game, and I happened to be sitting next to my oldest grandson, who has learned a lot about baseball. He's learned how to hit and how to throw and how to field. He's learned how to run the bases. But it's the culture of baseball that I really wanted to share with him. And I did so during the game. He would be asking me questions constantly. But what I did is I shared with him some phrases that only baseball people know. A phrase like a can of corn and a pitcher's best friend, which is also called sometimes the twin killing. I won't go into it. There's a Texas leaguer. There's phrases like that that have to do with the culture of baseball that I wanted my grandson to know. I tell you that because it's not just about the details of the events in this story, but it is about the culture that you and I need to understand. So we're going to delve into the culture that brings such great meaning to the story. To do that, I want to turn to an author by the name of Kenneth Bailey. Kenneth Bailey is a theologian who lives in Cairo, Egypt. He has lived for a long time in the Middle East, and he has studied in depth the culture of the Middle East, in particular the Aramaic language, and how it reflects the culture because Jesus spoke in Aramaic. And he, in a book he wrote entitled The Cross and the Prodigal, connects Jesus' story of the prodigal son to the cross. His premise is that most Muslims accept the story of the prodigal son, but they say there is no cross, there's no gospel there. But when you come to understand the backdrop of the prodigal son story that Jesus tells, you will see the gospel in living colors. And so we need to understand some things about the times in which Jesus told this story, the people to whom he told it, and how they heard this story. This is going to be new to some of you. The understanding of the story all hinges on the understanding of something called the Kezoza ceremony. Now, what is the Kezoza ceremony? The Kezoza ceremony was a reality of life for the Jewish people. And what it had to do with was the fact that if anyone in their village, and by the way, to live in a Jewish village back in the days of Jesus meant that your business was everybody's business. There was no privacy. Everybody knew what was going on all the time. We say that of small towns like the one we live in, but boy, this was everybody's business on steroids. With that understanding, when somebody took money from the Jewish community, from their family, and they went to a far land, to a Gentile land, and they lost all that money in that Gentile land, when they came back, when they returned, word would have gotten out already that so-and-so was returning from that Gentile land, having lost all of our Jewish money. They would meet that person outside of the village and have this ceremony where they threw pottery at his feet, broke the pottery as if to say, we break any connection we have with you. You no longer have a connection with us as the Jewish people, with our village. You are not welcome. You have been disowned. Okay, I don't know if you knew that, But that was a big deal. See, that's the backdrop of the story of the prodigal son. Dr. John Farrar, who is a biblical teacher, puts it this way: from an apologetic standpoint, this Kezaza ceremony is remarkable. It's a known feature of ancient Judaism tracing back to the Talmud. In the story of the prodigal son, this insight gives one more line of historical evidence testifying to the historicity of the Gospels, the teaching value of this story, and the Jewish culture context for interpreting the Bible. Okay, so in other words, you have to have the understanding of this ceremony to understand what's going on. Well, we're going to pick the story up that Jesus told about halfway through. You know the beginning part, where the younger son, and it is about two sons, a father and two sons. The younger son is openly rebellious against his father. The older son, as we'll find out later in the story, is covertly rebellious against his father. So when the younger son comes and demands his inheritance, a couple things are at work. It is not that he's breaking the law. There was no law that said he couldn't ask for that inheritance, but he's showing that there's a broken relationship with the father, that no young man would ever treat his father this way. So when the younger son was demanding his inheritance from his father, what he was actually saying is that he was wishing his father was dead. That's a big deal, because traditionally a father never gave out inheritances, showed his will to his kids until he was on his deathbed. This father is not on his deathbed, as you're about to see in the story, or you might remember, he's not at all on his deathbed. He's coming saying, I wish you were dead so I could have my inheritance. In fact, I'm going to assume you're near enough to death that I can take my inheritance. Well, what the father did is really outlandish. And this story really has a lot of absurd parts to it that you and I miss. It's absurd that the son would ask or demand this, but the father giving it to him is absurd. The father probably gave him a parcel of land, that would be his inheritance, and he quickly sold it. He probably did not even get what the land was worth. He just wanted some money and get out of town. He then goes to a Gentile land, another foreign land, and his older brother will later say, oh, he spent it on harlots, and that kind of wild living. The truth of the matter is, his older brother was just trying to throw him under the bus. What he probably did is he wanted to go fit into another community, into another culture. And so he spent that money probably throwing parties for people to gain their favor and approval of who he was. Okay, so he spent it all, and then a famine hit the land. And now he was destitute and desperate. Really interesting insight. He then latched himself on to a certain man, and that's what the language really says. He latched onto a man and begged him. During a famine, things would get so desperate for people that he feared he was going to starve to death. So he latched himself onto a man that had a farm, and it appears that this man knew he was Jewish, knew he had come from a Jewish land, and guess what job he gives him, because he probably wants to get rid of him. I've got some pigs for you to feed. Okay, that all plays into it, and as he's feeding the pigs, he's saying, man, that food looks good to me. I can't believe it looks good because I don't want to starve to death. Okay, so we pick the story up there in Luke chapter 15, verse 17. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home, even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. Don't take that lightly. He thinks he is really dying. I will go home to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned both against you and heaven, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me as a hired servant. Two things to note there. Number one, this is not an act of repentance. It's not an act of contrition. It is an act of continued selfishness. I need food, and the only place I know I could probably find food to survive is to go back home. Okay, so he's not repenting. There's nothing in his practice statement that says, oh man, how much I have messed things up. I just want to be back in fellowship with my father. It's not that. This is the only way I know to get food. So that's the first thing I want you to know. The second thing is really interesting. We have just seen 2 times when the word home is used. In the next verse, we'll see it again, the word home. Actually, in the original language, the word home is not there, ever. So what are we to make of that? Well, the idea of home is inferred. And so what are they inferring? They're inferring that to be with the Father is to be home. That's a big deal. That's going to be a big deal in this lesson. To be with the Father is to be home. To be next to the Father is to be home. And so we pick the story up in verse 20. So he returned home. Again, that's not there. He returned to the Father. Here it says he returned home to the Father. And while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. His father was filled with love and compassion. That word compassion the word is splanchnizomai, and it means guts or intestines. You see, we've talked about this. In the Middle East, instead of saying, oh, with all my heart, from my innermost being, from my soul, I love you, they would say, from my intestines, from my guts. That's where the deepest emotions reside for the people in the Middle East. So from his gut, he has compassion on his son when he sees him. And then it says he ran. This is really important. The word ran there is the same word for when we read about a race. In other words, Paul will use that very word when he talks about winning the race and races run in the games, competitively racing. He races through the village. Now, you need to know, again, the absurdity of this. When Jesus is telling us, we would say, well, sure, I would be passionate and sprint towards my son. Any man over 25, certainly he's over 25, any father at his age would never do this, would never gird up his loins, which you'd need to do, bring his robe up into his hands and take off sprinting with bare legs. That was never seen. That would be humiliating. So when Jesus says he ran, the people listening to this thought, I can't even fathom that. It's hard to imagine. It seems absurd. But in this case, the Father runs toward the Son. And he embraces him and kisses him. We talked about that word. It's the word kataphilisine, and it means to consistently, non-stop kiss. You know what that means? It means that he just kissed him and kissed him and kissed him and kissed him. He would not stop. It was not just this congenial, peck and okay, you're back. He showers him with affection. And then his son says to him, he begins his speech that he has practiced all the way home. Father, I've sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. And before he can continue, the father is going to interrupt him. But remember, his point is, I need food. So I'm going to say what I need to say to get fed. So what is the father doing here? Well, first of all, we have often taught on this parable and said it seems to be about the younger son being a prodigal, but really it's about the older son representing the Pharisees. But I'm here to tell you, I'm convinced now, the entire Bible is about God. It's not about us. It's really not about people. It's about God. It's about knowing God, because in knowing God, you have eternal life. This story is about the Father. Yes, there are players other than the Father, but it's the Father that Jesus is describing in ways that most of us have no clue who this Father is. He seems like no other father you've ever seen. And so what is the Father doing? He is short-circuiting the Kazaza ceremony. He is making sure it never even begins. See how important that is? He does not want his son to be confronted by the village, the elders of the village, the people of the village, even children making fun of him and breaking off all relationship with him, making sure he doesn't enter the village. He is making sure he gets to him first. And as he's running through the village, as we're going to find in just a second here, it's a commotion. People are going, why is that old man running, showing his legs? And people follow him. His servants follow him. Do you see how big a deal it is to understand the context of what's going on here? Again, Kenneth Bailey in his book says it this way. The Father in his house clearly represents God. When the Father leaves the house and takes upon himself a humiliating posture on the road, he becomes a symbol of God incarnate. He's the Father at home when he runs through the village, sprints through the village, as though he's running a race. He becomes God incarnate. He becomes Jesus himself, who, as we know from Philippians 2, humbled himself and became a man, and not just any man, but a servant amongst men, and to the point of death. You see how incredible this story is? All of a sudden, Jesus is talking about himself and the humiliating thing that he's gone through to just come to earth. And so the Father interrupts the Son's speech in verse 22. But his Father said to his servants, see, they're right behind him, quick, bring the finest robe in the house. Oh, that's huge. Because when he puts that robe on, he is now wearing the Father's most elegant clothing. And when he wears that to the celebration that's about to ensue, all the townspeople who are invited to the celebration will see, oh, we're to treat him with respect. We can't keep him out of our village. We will treat him as the Father treats him. So putting on this robe means everything. He goes on. And put it on him, giving him a ring for his finger. And the word for ring is dactylios, which means in that culture the signet ring. The signet ring is the ring that was used to put onto a wax seal for a marriage covenant or for a will. He is officially a person of authority in the home now when they bring the ring. And then he goes on and says, not just the robe, not just the ring, but also sandals for his feet, and back again to Bailey. He says, slaves go barefoot, sons wear shoes. See what's happening? I'm not going to treat you like a slave. Nobody in this village is going to treat you like a slave. You are my son because you deserve to be my son. No, he does not deserve to be a son. He's absolutely undeserving of this. Verse 23 goes on and he says, and kill the calf we have been fattening. A calf was rare delicacy in a village. They almost never ate something like the calf. But in this occasion, we have fatted the calf for this moment. Unheard of. The Father then says, we must celebrate with a feast. Now watch verse 24. This is really the theme of the story. For he says, this son of mine was dead and now has returned to life. He was lost, but now he's found. So the party began. The party began just like when they found the sheep in the first story, found the coin in the second story, and now the son has been found. But don't miss what the Father said. The son of mine was dead and now has returned to life. This is a resurrection story. Did you ever think of this story as a resurrection story? Before Jesus will ever raise from the dead, this is a story he tells about resurrection. And why would the Father risk all this? Running to him, just showering him with all this honor, because he wants to save him from the kazaza ceremony, from shame. He is about honoring the one who does not deserve to be honored. We call that grace. In essence, the Father is saying, welcome home where you belong. Welcome home. This is about going home and giving honor. That's what it's about. Together, those two items point to a restored relationship. That's what that story is about. Jesus tells a story of resurrection, which means a relationship has been restored, and that's the big point. Going home, giving honor, a relationship has been restored. So that's Jesus' story. Now we're going to move on to Jesus' statements. We're moving to the cross. And that brings us to our location. Steve, did you know that there's a cross behind you with Jesus still on it? Yeah, I know. And it's perfect for what we're about to read, because we're going to talk about the 7 statements very quickly that Jesus made from the cross. And I have to tell you that story I told you before about when we went to Nogales, Mexico, and we're walking through different shops. And of course, Mexico being mostly Catholic, The crosses in one shop all had Jesus on them. And the man there that owned the shop was trying to sell me those crosses with Jesus on it. He was using some broken English. You buy, you buy. And I told him, in great English actually, no, Jesus is not still on the cross. And I left and I went to some other shops. We as a family went to some other shops, but we had to return through his shop. And by the time we returned, he had taken Jesus off the cross. Said, now you buy? I had to buy it. And I still have that today in my office. And you see the places where it was connected. The body of Jesus was connected to the cross. Okay, so of course I know that Jesus is no longer on the cross, but for what we're talking about now, this is perfect. And so we are quickly going to run through these 7 statements in chronological order from the cross of Jesus, because I think they illustrate what we're after here. The same thing we saw in the story Jesus told, and that is that the first 3 statements are about giving honor, grace. The last 4 statements are about going home. Again, I will not spend much time on these. We've done that in the past. I just want you to see the pattern, the picture. The first thing he said from the cross is about forgiveness, and it's in Luke 23:34. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He's talking about the Roman soldiers who are crucifying him, offering them forgiveness. That is honoring them with grace. The second thing he says from the cross is about the future. He says to the thief next to him on the cross in Luke chapter 23 verse 43, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. You have a future. I just gave you a future. Again, deservingly? No. Absolutely undeserved. It is giving honor, grace, to somebody who does not deserve it. The Roman soldiers didn't deserve it. This thief on the cross does not deserve it. Now, the third statement is when Jesus looks down and sees his mother next to his disciple John, and he says in John 19:26, woman, behold your son, behold your mother. Family. He is now instituting new ideas about family. The family is not just about blood, it's about faith, and both of you have faith. And John, because of your faith and because of her faith, you will care for her. Did they deserve this? Did Mary deserve this? Not necessarily, but it is giving honor to her and to John. Grace. These 3 statements are truly about giving honor, about showing grace, forgiveness, a future, and a family. Now we'll move on to the rest of the statements, the last 4, but to get there, I'm going to ask you a discussion question, and I'll give you my answer to the discussion question before I give it to you, because it's very personal. This week I was thinking about going home, and some of my most memorable times of going home. I had just finished my internship here in Montrose and was going home from that summer in 1985, and I decided, without telling my parents, there were no cell phones, so that's my excuse, but I could have probably called them. I decided to drive all the way in one shot by myself through the night, 18 and a half hours, so that when I got there and knocked on the door of my home, the house was dark, of course, the door was locked, and I knocked 2 or 3 times. Finally, my dad, through the door, says, "Who is it? What do you want?" I said, "Your son has come home." He opened it and he was like white as a ghost. And he said, "What are you doing? I could have gotten a gun and shot you." That was one of my favorites. But another favorite was when we took our high school and college age students to Ukraine for 3 weeks. And upon return, we flew across the United States on July 4th. And we watched the fireworks going off below us in the night. And then we arrived in Tucson, and many of us, when we got off the airplane, got down on our hands and knees and kissed the ground. We were so glad to be home. Discussion question: what are some of the most memorable homegoings in your life? And so these last 4 statements from the cross are about going home. I'll remind you that Jesus prayed in the upper room John chapter 17, verse 5. Now, Father, bring me into the glory we shared before the world began. In other words, I'm ready to come home. So the second four statements from the cross are about Jesus going home, about him finishing well, being faithful to the end. The first one comes in Matthew 27, Mark 15 as well, when it says at about 3 o'clock Jesus called out with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? It is at this moment he senses all sin has been dumped on him at the cross, and his Father has turned away from him. The fellowship is broken, but this is the beginning of coming home. It is what has to happen before he comes home. He's actually quoting from Psalm 22. This was prophesied 1,000 years earlier. The second statement in this series of statements is, I thirst. You find that in John chapter 19, verse 28. And he's simply saying, my humanity is still real to me. I thirst. The limitations of humanity are reminding me how much I'm ready to come home. The third statement is found in John 19:30. When Jesus had tasted the sour wine they gave him, he said, it is finished. Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Three things you need to know about this incredible statement. It is finished is one word. Tetelestai, we've talked about this before. It's a fantastic word. Merchants used it to say you've paid in full. Priests used it to say the sacrifice is finished. Military commanders used it to say we have won. The war is over. And judges used it to say you are now free to go. Your debt has been paid. It is finished. Then he bowed his head. That word, as we mentioned before, is found also in Matthew 8:20, when Jesus is being followed by people and they say, we want to follow you. And he says, are you sure about that? Because foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man, speaking of himself, has nowhere to lay his head. I do not have a home. The word lay is kleino or klino, and it's used again when Jesus bows his head on the cross. He is home. He has completed the mission, the task, and now it's time to rest. And he gives up his spirit. Literally, the terminology there is he released it. He's not a victim. He chose the moment that he would release his spirit. And so much happened when that moment took place. Our debt was paid. The sacrifices would end. This is the last sacrifice. The victory is won. We don't have to be concerned about winning a victory against Satan. It is done. And our debt has been paid in full. We are no longer guilty. Isn't that amazing? In one phrase and in one moment, he says, I've completed it. Finds his home on the cross. And then the final statement from the cross, the fourth in this series, is found in Luke 23 and John 19. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. I trust you. Jesus finishes well. He's faithful to the end, which begs the question. We say we want to be like Jesus, that it is imperative that we finish well. Christy and I talk about this often. We see too many people who are not finishing well, who are not faithful to the end. How about you? We ask that of ourselves all the time. Are we finishing well? And so we're focused on Jesus, the story he told, the statements he made, and finally we come to the startling events that now take place that solidify our status with him. There are three of them that we'll look at. First of all is the darkness. We read in Matthew 27:45, at noon darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. Darkness, not it got cloudy, not a windstorm came up, blew dust in. It became dark. There are unbelieving historians, okay, not Christ followers, who validate historically that this happened at this moment. It became dark. The darkness, I believe, is symbolic of the sin being dumped on Jesus. Sin is always equated with darkness. At this moment, at noon, for 3 hours, it gets dark. It gets black. That, I believe, according to John 1:1-3 and Colossians 1:17, shows us that Jesus is still in charge of creation at this moment. You might remember that in Joshua chapter 10, 2 Kings chapter 20, and Isaiah 38, Jesus tinkered with the sun. Sometimes he stopped it, sometimes he made it go backwards, but the point is, and we know that that's how they saw it, he was actually stopping the rotation of the earth. It's not just that Jesus could do that, it's that he did that. And I believe he did that on the cross. He commanded darkness at this moment. The second startling event that took place is the direct access to God. We see that in Matthew 27, verse 50. Then Jesus shouted out again, and he released his spirit. At that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, rocks split apart. There was a dividing, a tearing of the veil from top to bottom, meaning no man could have done this. The size of this veil, the size of this curtain. But what divided man from God, as though they believed God was in the Holy of Holies, and only one man, one high priest, one time a year could go in there. Now the whole world had access to the Father. That was truly a startling event. So you have the darkness, you have the dividing of the veil, and finally you have the dead coming to life. Matthew chapter 27, verse 52. And tombs opened. The bodies of many godly men and women who had died were raised from the dead. They left the cemetery after Jesus' resurrection, went into the holy city of Jerusalem, and appeared to many people. I can't imagine. We're in a cemetery right now. I can't imagine people getting up out of their graves. The dead come to life. That is a metaphor for the power of Jesus. These are startling events. And if he can bring life to the dead, he can bring life to us. That's what Peterson is referring to in his message in Romans chapter 8, verse 15. This resurrection life you receive from God is not a timid, grave-tending life. He goes on to say, no, it's a life that is unlike any other life because we have the Spirit of God living in and through us. It's not a grave-tending life. It's not a life where we just walk around and mow the grass in the cemetery. It's something much more powerful. There are 3 startling events that I believe Jesus was in charge of that show us that the resurrection is about him. That's the context for the resurrection. I know usually we talk about all the details of the resurrection, but if you miss Jesus, the details don't really matter, do they? So what? So what's the resurrection have to do with us? Well, I'm going to give you 6 passages right now that will connect what Jesus did to who we are. John 13:15 from the upper room after Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you. Follow my example, he says. 1 John 2:6. Those who say they live in God should live their lives as Jesus did. Ephesians 5:1. Imitate God, therefore, in everything you do, because you are his dear children. Like a child imitates his father, imitate your father. Philippians 2:5. You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. What was his attitude? I'm going home, and I'm going to give honor to those who don't even deserve to be honored. It's called grace. Philippians 3:10. I want to know Christ, Paul wrote, and experience the mighty power that raised him from the dead. I want to suffer with him, sharing in his death, so that one way or another I will experience the resurrection from the dead. Yes, someday I'll be raised from the dead, but right now I can experience that power that raised Jesus from the dead. And finally, 1 Peter 2:21, for God called you to do good, even if it means suffering. But as Christ suffered for you, he is your example, and you must follow in his steps. What's it have to do with us? Everything. Everything. He rose from the dead. He showed us how to go home well, to finish well in this life, as difficult as it is. And he brought honor. He gave honor to all those around him, especially those who never deserved it. Question: does the name Maurice Joseph Micklewhite ring a bell for you? I'll bet it doesn't. We should do a show of hands. I'm sure no one's raising your hand. Mr. Micklewhite, have you ever heard of him? How about Michael Caine? Have you heard of him? Same guy. Same guy. In fact, funny story. In recent years, he changed his passport because every time he went to board an airplane and showed his passport, showed his license, people said, no, you're Michael Caine. So he finally changed his official name to Michael Caine. Great stuff. In the 60s, the world couldn't get enough of him. He became a star, a movie star. He was nominated for 6 Academy Awards. He won 2 Academy Awards. His story is remarkable. He is still alive. He's 93 years old. He's retired from acting, but he is certainly one of the most famous actors the world has seen in the last half century. It's not that I really want to talk that much about Michael Caine, because I'd rather talk about his mom, Ellen Caine. His mom and her husband, who worked in a fish factory, raised their kids in a district of South London during World War II. And for all those years, not just during World War II when they were being bombed, but for all those years of raising those kids, she worked so hard and they were so poor that every penny mattered for survival. She worked by cleaning not her own house, but other people's houses. It is said that the kids had patches upon patches upon patches on their clothes because that's all they could do. They couldn't afford new clothes. Michael Caine says that he remembers his mom's hands bleeding from scrubbing the floors of other people. It was all about survival. For Ellen, it was all about fearing that she would not be able to put food on the table for her family. And she worked tirelessly to make sure that could happen. She was fearful, she was worried, she was exhausted. But they survived. And so her son becomes famous. Well, you can imagine Michael was very grateful to his mother for all that she had done. I think his dad passed away long before his mother. His mother passed away in 1989. But he saw his fame not as a destination, but as a doorway. And on the other side of the door was this idea: my mother will never suffer again. He eventually would buy her a home so that she didn't answer to a landlord for the first time in her life. What she saw was hers. She didn't have to worry anymore. But at one point she asked her son this question. It's remarkable. She said, Michael, how much do you make for every film you do? And his answer to her was, I make £1 million. Well, translated, I had to find the translation. He made about $1.3 million for every film. She then followed up that first question with another question, and she said, how much is that? She had no context. She had no idea. All she knew were pennies. When he said £1 million, she said, I don't even know what that is. And so he answered this way. It means that you'll never have to work again. That's what it means. It means that you'll never have to worry about money again. And just like that, she understood. Not the numbers, not the money, but she understood the idea of absolute freedom for the first time. Freedom from work, freedom from worry, from exhaustion, from fear. That's what she now understood. Throughout his career, Michael Caine would often say this: everything I am, I owe to her. He realized, I can never forget that she made all of this possible. I want you to remember that phrase, everything I am, I owe to her, because her story and that interaction with her son, where she could not grasp numbers and money, but she could grasp freedom and peace for the first time in her life. Reminds me of the resurrection. It reminds me of the story Jesus told, of the statements he made, and of the startling events at the end of his time on the cross. Going home, giving honor to others. As Michael Caine had said, everything I am I owe to her, because of the resurrection of Jesus, because of how he went home, because of how he treated people. This is true of us. Everything we are, we owe to him. He did things that we cannot measure. I cannot put my mind around how a father could offer up his son as my sacrifice. I cannot put my mind around how he could take my sins and the sins of everyone in the world of all time. I cannot put my mind around how he could be raised from the dead. All those things I cannot grasp, but I can grasp the freedom and the peace and the joy that is mine because of what he did. May you and I go home well, and in the process, may we give honor to people who don't necessarily deserve it. Everything we are, we owe to him. That's the context of the resurrection. Happy Resurrection Sunday. We love you. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. God bless you all.